Hello and welcome back to Technical and Business Writing. This is Professor Plyman. Today we're going to be talking about creating graphics. If you think back to the last lecture video when I was talking about organizational structures, every single organizational structure was like, and use graphics to help, and use graphics to help. Creating graphics can really help communicate a lot to your reader. So we're going to talk about how you do it and what are the purpose of graphics. So there's a lot of importance in graphics in technical writing, and they can do several things. The first thing is they can catch the reader's attention and interest. If there is text and graphics on a page, our eyes are immediately drawn to the graphics first. So this is what will pull your reader in. And then a lot of times they can help writers communicate information that it's difficult to communicate with words. They can help writers clarify and emphasize important information. They can help non-native speakers of English understand what you're trying to say. And they can help writers communicate information to multiple audiences with different interests, aptitudes, and reading habits. So graphics have an important job in technical writing, and they tend to do that job very well. So let's talk about when graphics are better than words. Graphics are really indispensable when we're talking about demonstrating logical and numerical relationships. Something like a chart or a graph does way more for our brains than just explaining those numbers to us. Graphics can create spatial information more effectively than words alone. A lot of times, graphics can communicate steps in a process more effectively than words alone. And graphics can also help us save space. They can have a lot of information in a reduced amount of space. Sometimes it takes a lot of words to explain a concept that we can easily do with a graphic. And then graphics also can help us reduce the cost of documents intended for international readers. This is why if you buy a piece of furniture from IKEA, the instructions don't have words. It's all graphics. That's because it does not matter what language you speak, you can clearly understand the graphics. So let's talk about what an effective graphic has. So it has 5 characteristics. It does 5 things. First of all, it serves a purpose. Do not put it in there if it doesn't serve a purpose. It is simple and uncluttered. And I'm going to also extend this to it fits in well with the page. It presents a manageable amount of information. It meets your reader's expectations in terms of format. If it's a chart or a graph or something like that, your reader can easily pull the information out of it because you have followed the rules related to those specific formats, and it is clearly labeled. So there's some things that you want to make sure that you're doing when you're creating graphics to follow all of the sort of ethical and legal rules. First of all, if you're using somebody else's information, you need to explain that to your reader, and you need to obtain permission from the creator of the graphic. You need to include all relevant data. A lot of times, if somebody is being less than ethical, they only include the data that supports what they're trying to say. This should not be you. Include all relevant data. Begin your access in your graphs at 0, or if you don't, mark them clearly. A lot of times when somebody is trying to be intentionally misleading, they'll start one graph at 50 and the other bar graph at 0. Don't do that. They should all be the same, or if they're not all the same, you need to make sure that it is very clear that they're different and why you have made that choice. Do not use a table to hide a data point that would be obvious in a graph. So for example, if the answers that we got from our experiments are 3, 2.5, 4, 2 1/3, and 73, right? That information is going to be much clearly seen in a graph than a table. So make sure that you are using the type of graphic that best communicates to the reader. Show items as they really are. And make sure that you're not using color or shading to misrepresent an item's importance. So let's talk about how you integrate graphics into your document. So the first thing that you're going to do is place the graphic in an appropriate location. If a particular graphic matches up with a particular paragraph, it should be close to that paragraph. You're going to introduce the graphic in the text. So according to the chart as seen here, and then explain what it is or why you've used that. You're going to make the graphic clearly visible and make it easy to find. If you're talking about a chart in a paragraph on page 3 of your document, the chart should be on page 3 or maybe on the very next page. But you don't want to send your readers on a scavenger hunt trying to find your graphic. And then as you plan graphics, I want you to think about the following. Who is your audience? What are they likely to do with this information? What is your purpose? What is it that you want your audience to do with this information? What kind of information do you want to communicate? What are the physical conditions in which readers will use this document? How much time and money do you have to spend on creating these graphics? What equipment and expertise do you already have that will help you? So let's talk about where you can find graphics. First, easiest one out there, use existing graphics. If your company or organization already has graphics, they fit well within your document, use them. You can also modify existing graphics. You can create graphics on a computer or create them yourself, or you can have somebody else create graphics. There are technical designers who their whole job is to create graphics. Maybe if you are creating a very important document or a lengthy document for your organization, you're going to outsource the graphics. That's always a perfectly valid thing to do if you have the time, the budget, and the resources to do so. If you're going to create the graphics yourself, there's some things that you should be aware of though. First of all, use color effectively. Do not overdo it. You don't want every, line of text on your graphic to be a different color or something like that. But you can use color to emphasize particular items. You can use color to create patterns. So for example, if we have a pie chart and a bar graph that are representing basically the same information, we want each category to be the same color on those two different graphics. Use contrast effectively. You can take advantage of any symbolic meanings that colors may already have. So for example, if you're talking about the rate of babies born in your hospital and how many are girls and boys, it might make sense to use colors that we typically associate with girls and with boys. But do be aware that color can obscure or swallow up text, so make sure that you are keeping your document readable. You can use colors to establish patterns. So we can see in this graphic that there's explanations for what each color means. But unless, you struggle with color blindness, you can probably see that there is purple in 4 out of 5 of these images, but there is no description below of what the purple means. So make sure your graphics, your colors are establishing a pattern. So let's talk about some technical information categories that you might want to turn into a graphic. Numerical information, logical relationships. Maybe you're going to use graphics to describe process descriptions and instructions, or maybe even visual or spatial characteristics. So let's talk about your best tools for illustrating numerical data. This is going to be tables, bar graphs, infographics, line graphs, and pie charts. And you are probably pretty familiar with all of these, even if you haven't created them before yourself. Most of us know how to read this, and these are tools that are pretty readable for most of our audiences. If we're looking at creating or indicating logical relationships, maybe we're going to use a diagram or even an organizational chart. So I know, for example, if I go into Microsoft Teams and click on my name, I can see directly above me who is my boss, and directly above her who is her boss, and directly above her who is her boss, and see the organizational chart for our department. So it makes sense when we're looking at relationships. If we're illustrating like a process description and instructions, maybe we're going to use a checklist. So for example, here's what you're going to do in step 1, check it off. Here's what you're going to do in step 2. Maybe we're going to use tables or flowcharts or even logic trees. If we're looking at illustrating visual and spatial characteristics, sometimes a photograph helps, or even a screenshot. And then we're also going to see line drawings and maps used to create visual and spatial characteristics. So let's talk about the things that you can do to create effective tables. First of all, indicate the units of measure. In the stub or the left-hand column, list the items that are being compared, and then in the columns, arrange the data clearly and logically. So for example, if we're looking at, how many products were sold of the 12 months of the year, start with the first month, start with January, then you go to February, then March, make it make sense. Arrange the data clearly and logically. Do the math. Make sure that all of your math is correct. If there's a blank spot, indicate that. Don't make your table wider or taller than it needs to be. Minimize the use of rules, but do provide footnotes where necessary. And then if you did not generate this information yourself, tell your reader where you got the information. So we have vertical and horizontal bar graphs. We can kind of see some examples of this here. I hope the first thing that you noticed is that these axes are not clearly labeled. I don't know if each one of these tick marks is 1 or 1 million, right? So make sure that everything is always clearly labeled. So let's talk about some things that you can do to create effective bar graphs. Make the proportions fair. If possible, begin the quantity scale at 0 and use tick marks along the axis to signal the amounts. Once again, we're going to arrange the bars in a logical sequence and place the title below the figure. Indicate the source of your information if you did not generate it yourself. So we can see that this is a much more effective bar graph. Everything is clearly labeled. We know what is happening here. It's easy to see how much each of the bars are worth. We understand based on the letters at the bottom of the graph that we're looking at months here: January, February, March, April, May, and June. And we can see what each of those bars represents. Now let's talk about infographics. No, this is an infographic of infographics, and it's talking about infographics, but it's really fun. We can pull a lot of information out of it, and this can be a very effective way to communicate with your audience. So let's talk about some things you can do to create an effective infographic. First of all, an infographic is going to make a claim. You're going to suggest, hey, this new medicine will make you healthier, or you should, go to this college, that sort of thing. Always use accurate data. Follow the guidelines for the type of graphic that you are creating. So for example, if you're using a pie chart in your infographic, you have to follow all of the pie chart rules. Write concisely. Infographics should not be too wordy, and they should not present too much information. And then test the infographic. This means that you give it to somebody and you say, can you pull all the information out of it? Is it overwhelming? Do you feel like it has enough? Do you understand what is happening here? And this feedback can be extremely beneficial in making sure that your purpose is fulfilled. So let's talk about line graphs. If possible, once again, begin the scale. Begin the scale at 0. If not, clearly indicate what it starts at and why. Use reasonable proportions for both the horizontal and the vertical axis. And use grid lines, either horizontal, vertical, or both, because this helps your reader really be able to read the quantities precisely. So here's an example of an effective line graph, and we can kind of see what is on the vertical as well as the horizontal axis, and what information it is that we're trying to ascertain. Now this one doesn't start at 0, but it does give us enough space in the graph to understand why they would start it at 100 instead of 0, based on the direction that the lines are moving. Now let's talk about pie charts. If you have more than 7 slices of a pie chart, that's probably too much information. So maybe pick something other than a pie chart. You're going to begin with the largest slice at the top and then work clockwise in order of decreasing size. If you have something that's a very, very small quantities, you might want to group a couple of small quantities together in one slice. So for example, if we're looking at types of pets people have, I'm going to assume that dogs and cats both make up a big portion of that pie chart, right? But maybe we have a very small percentage of people who own snakes and a very small percentage of people who own geckos or lizards. And maybe I'm going to just kind of lump that all together and say reptiles, parentheses, including snakes, leopard, geckos, and bearded dragons. And then place a label horizontally, not radially, inside each slice. You want to make sure that if you're trying to emphasize a particular slice, you use a bright contrasting color, or you can separate it and pull it out from the pie. Make sure that your software follows the appropriate guidelines for pie charts, and don't fill it with patterns. It's too visually overwhelming. And then you always want to do the math and make sure that all of your percentages add up to 100%. So let's talk about this graphic here, where it talks about context for change, right? We can see that all of these pie slices are the same size. Are these all equally important? And if so, why did we use something that looks like a pie chart? So make sure that you're asking those sorts of questions when you are creating graphics, and even when you come across graphics. If you are needing to show motion, there's a couple of things that you can do. You can use arrows or other symbols to suggest the direction in which something is moving or should be moved. You can use shake lines to suggest vibration. Starburst lines usually suggest a blinking light, or even an image of like a before and after suggests an action. Okay, so maybe you're not going to use a chart or a graph. Maybe instead you're going to use a photograph. Let's talk about some rules for using photographs. First of all, try to use a photograph that doesn't have a lot of background clutter, as that can distract readers. You also want to make sure that you're not electronically manipulating the image. You want to be ethical and honest here. Help your readers understand perspective, and if it's appropriate, include a common object to sort of give your readers a sense of scale. And then if you need to, go through and label components or important features. So for example, if there's something specific that you want your audience to look at or be aware of in the photograph, go ahead and label it or list that. Now let's talk about when you want to use a line drawing and when you want to use a photograph. So line drawings can focus readers' attention on desired information better than photographs can. Line drawings can also highlight information that might be obscured by photographs if there's bad lighting or bad angles. And line drawings are sometimes easier for readers to understand than photographs are. This also includes the potential for people to be distracted by photographs, whereas line drawings tend to do a better job emphasizing certain information. So this line drawing right here clearly indicates the information that the creator is trying to portray. This is a much better graphic than a photograph of this situation would be. Excuse me. Now, let's talk about effective graphics for multicultural readers. There's some things that I want you to know of. First of all, reading patterns differ. Not all languages read from left to right, top to bottom, so make sure your graphics are presented in a way that is logical for the language that you expect your readers to be. Make sure that you are aware of varying cultural attitudes towards giving instructions. Some cultures want absolutely every detail and step and sub-step, whereas other cultures only want you to hit the major bullet points. De-emphasize trivial details. If something doesn't necessarily matter as much as the rest of your text, make sure that you are demonstrating that. Avoid cultural specific language, symbols, and references because they're not universal. Portray people very carefully. And be very careful of portraying hand gestures in graphics because there is no universal hand gestures. They mean different things in different languages. If you have questions about anything that we talked about today in terms of creating graphics, just shoot me an email or reach out. I am always happy to help.